All right, welcome back everybody. We're going to be sculpting a rock today, or at least that's the goal. So I didn't mention it last time, but we're going to need PureRef. Go to pureref.com and you're going to download PureRef. It's an open source application. You shouldn't have to purchase anything. It's going to allow us to load some assets, or not assets, but some reference images so that we can basically refresh our minds as to what rocks look like. It sounds basic, but it's actually pretty important. Again, we're also going to need GIMP or some other paint program, advanced paint program, preferably not MS Paint. We're also going to need references. I have some references you can download. If you go to polynormal.gumroad.com, this is my reference page, so you can download this for free. It's a set of images, reference images, that you can use in the actual, if you don't want to actually hunt through the internet and look for rocks. I mean, you could. There's a lot of images out there. I went and photographed some rocks in the woods, and you can use these images for free for that purpose. Okay, so I'm going to run PureRef and load up some rock images. We're going to open up some rock references, and I'm just going to dump these into PureRef. And of course, it made them massively huge. Oh, cool! It actually arranged them for us. That's very nice. Okay, so PureRef is interesting because you right-click, you move the window around, but I can never remember what it is to. Anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter. So this sort of gives us an idea of what rocks will look like. These kinds of rocks, anyway. Rocks are fascinating. There's all kinds of different rocks. You have lichen, you have moss, you have different meshing textures depending on whether, like, what minerals were involved when the thing solidified from magma. Most of the rocks you see here are probably igneous rocks. Metamorphic rocks are more interesting. Usually a lot of gemstones like, what's it called, like garnets and obsidian and different things would be considered metamorphic. Apparently slate is a metamorphic version of shale. So shale is actually a sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rocks are formed when sediment or debris or whatever else it is builds up layers and solidifies in such a way that they form these like almost crumbly, loose organizations. Metamorphic rock is when lots of heat and pressure act upon the rock or this particular substance, whether it's igneous or sedimentary. They act upon the rock and press it and heat it, but they heat it below its melting temperature, so it doesn't become igneous rock. It changes the crystalline structure without completely melting it. So you get these smeared striations through the rock. Most of this stuff though is like granites and different types of mineral organizations. And granite is a igneous rock, so it was formed from cooled lava, cooled magma deep under the earth, and then through the tectonic actions of the crust, it moves the rock towards the surface. So long story short, anyway, that's what we're looking at here. It's mostly what you'll see outside too. What's fascinating to me about this is that you'll have these corners and ridges, and then you'll have like these, I don't know what to call them, like these depressions or ridges along the surface. So there's a lot of nested detail in a rock. You'll also have like rigid edges here on these rocks that were broken but never, I guess, tumbled with glacial movements. But then you'll have some rocks that are just like worn off and just smooth like boulders and round, but it's the same mineral compositions. I guess they just have more action on them, more wear from whatever caused them to break apart. And ironically, the what you're seeing here, especially here, you can see it, is these ridges are formed when the rock fractures and breaks. So it turns from a bigger rock into a smaller rock. But it gives the rock these really neat characteristic details. I find the larger the rock is, these are just general observations, the larger the rock is, like huge, like, I don't know, 10-meter wide boulders, they have a tendency to be a lot more round in appearance, whereas the smaller ones have a tendency to be much more jagged and sharp. So this is the pure ref. We're going to need, eventually, we're going to need GIMP as well. So I will just open up GIMP, and it's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. Well, it's actually not very simple, but we'll go through that in time. So pure ref is really just here so that we can get an idea for, oh, it's the middle mouse button. That's what it is. Okay. Scroll wheel, middle mouse button. Just to remind ourselves what a rock generally looks like. Like, you can, if you want, go and sculpt a specific rock, but this is more just to remind ourselves what the general look of the rock is. So I'm going to grab my tablet. No, actually, first of all, we're going to do a setup scene in Blender. Okay, so in Blender, you have this area you start out with. So we're just going to, you'll probably start with a cube and a light. I've set up a default file to load so that it sets up my system settings for the file settings automatically every time I load it. But essentially you'll have a cube, a light, and a camera. You just press the same thing, A and then X, deletes everything. We're going to add a cube. And it's not in the center, of course, because you'll remember the cursor is where everything from the primitive meshes is loaded into. So we're going to snap, oh, it's W. So you press W for context related menus, selection to grid, selection to cursor, and then you can go all the way down here. Actually, if you go into snap under object, cursor to world origin, that's what I want. And then we're going to want to do that again under object, snap, selection to cursor. Except we need to select it. That would be very helpful, wouldn't it? There we go. So send to your camera, your viewport camera. All right, so the scene is mostly set up, but it's set up well enough for sculpting. Now I want you to go across the top here and select your sculpting layout. And of course, it looks like everything just appeared, but it's just your object is super, super tiny. Actually, that's a good point. First of all, right now it's 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters. That's much too small. So the rocks I'm going to be making are like, I don't know, they're a meter square is a little large. So I'm going to make them 60 centimeters wide, tall, and just a box, 60 centimeters. There we go. And now, of course, transform, apply, scale. There we go. All right, sculpting. Now we're way too close. Actually, to sculpt, we need. No, actually, you could do that in here. You should be able to do it in here. We'll just drag this open so we can see what these brushes do. And we're going to go down to Dino Topo. So if I press Z right now, you can see that the wireframe is very basic. It's just a box. Dino Topo will, it doesn't preserve, anyway, that's complicated. Dino Topo will actually try to maintain a certain mesh density based off of what you tell it to do. So what we want it to do is subdivide collapse is fine, and relative detail is also fine. So basically this is going to say 12 pixels. No, we want constant detail. Relative detail is dependent on how close you are to the mesh. So what we want to do is we want to sample what is currently here, just to make sure that we don't flood too much. So we'll sample it. It says it's 1.18. So let's change that to about 20. And detail flood fill. Now it's pretty fast, but that's because it only added a little bit of poly detail. So let's change it to 50. It's better to creep up on this because if you add like, if you say 300 down there and you end up with like 60 million polygons in your scene, your computer, your Blender program will just crash. Detail flood fill. Okay, that's getting a little better. Let's try, I found about 100 works well. Yeah, so maybe 150. And if you have a slower machine, you might have to leave that. You might have to leave that lower. Okay. One other thing I had failed to mention is that this will be a lot easier with a tablet. You can do it with a mouse, but it's just a little bit easier for control to use a tablet for this operation for sculpting. So we're going to turn Dino-Topo off. You could leave it on, but it does slow down the viewport quite a bit when you're adding or you're changing geometry, because it tries to maintain the same level of geometric detail when you add or remove geometry. So it has to calculate all of that. So the way sculpting actually works in Blender is right now it looks like a cube, but what we're going to do is we're going to change that by just for now we'll use draw. So if I draw, you can see it's adding something to the cube. Now we might ask, what is it adding? Right now, since Dino-Topo is off, it's not actually adding any polys. You see our face count is still at 196,000. So if I add more, it's not adding anything. What it's doing is displacing geometry. So it's moving it, stretching it. So my preferred method is to change the mesh a whole bunch, in whatever shape I want it to be in. Often what happens, like I'll show you here with grab, we're going to go grab, and then we're going to, just ram it in there. So I don't know if you can see this. Hold on. That makes it easier. Okay. So this is just X-ray. It also works in wireframe, which is kind of nice because then you can just have wireframe that's sort of like pseudo. Anyway, what happens is grab will compress these. I don't know if you can see it well enough there. It'll compress the polygons so they're real narrow. That can cause some serious visual errors or glitching. It looks strange sometimes. And it's also way too like pointed or narrow there. So what I like to do is after I do an operation like this where it dramatically changes the general shape of the object, I'll just do another detail flood fill. And what that does is it looks terrible here, but that's not actually too bad because what it's done is it's equalized the mesh for poly size. Or it's at least tried. It's done a pretty good job. So now if you were to do something else, like you want it to smooth, F changes brush size. Oh, I don't have screencast on. Oh, screencast is weird. Okay, F changes brush size. F and drag. So this is a smooth brush. What it does is it relaxes the polygons. And you'll also notice with smooth, it's important to understand how some of these brushes work. If I change the detail to 50, and then I do a detail flood fill, I don't believe smooth actually changes the the shape, the detail when you're using Dino-Topo. It doesn't add any extra polygons. It never does that. It just relaxes them. So I'm going to turn Dino-Topo off. So now that I have a much lower detail or lower res mesh, if I use the smooth operation, it does a lot more. Like it has a much more dramatic effect on how far it moves the vertices. It's relative to complexity. So if I was to change Dino-Topo to, if I was to change the density to something like 200 instead, fill the mesh, it takes a little while sometimes. You have to wait till that button grays out again. There we go. So now it doesn't look like anything's changed, but that's because Dino-Topo has tried to preserve the poly count as well as it can. So these flat polys are actually several polygons now. So what I can do now is I can smooth, but it doesn't have as dramatic a effect on the corner. Smoothing, it's rounding it a little bit, but not like the dramatic amount here. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So looking back at our rock, we have to think about what type of shapes do we want. This is an ideal rock for just what our purpose is now. I found one of the best ways of forming a rock generally is to use the grab function. Make sure dyno topo is off, because otherwise your computer will probably choke. And we're just going to like play with the mesh until it has the kind of look we're going for. So, I mean, every rock's different. Your reference might be different. I'm going to change a few things around. I kind of want it sort of like flat, and I think I'm going to progress to a different brush now. So generally after a lot of grab operations, I will flood fill again just to remove any of the strange pinching or compressed artifacts you'll often find when you're altering the mesh this way. Okay, so dyno topo again. I'm going to reduce it to 150 and detail flood fill. So that should bring us to the next stage. Alt and middle mouse button will center your view in sculpt mode on any part of the vertex, any part of the mesh that you actually select. So it's quite helpful for large meshes that you're working on, like huge busts or something like that. Okay, so we're gonna go to scrape, and scrape is interesting. It's dyno topo still on. Scrape is interesting. It's like clay. You just scrape a plane. So we're going to establish some planes for the rock. Just straightforward. I like to do the macro operations of big ones with a big brush, and I can go in and do some smaller ones later. There's some specialty scrape settings we're going to be using later on, but this is just to give us a little bit more of a rock shape. You know, I mean, this is where the artistry of sculpting comes in. You can know all you can know about how the tools work, but sometimes you actually just need to develop an eye for, you know, the translating what you'd like to see happen into something that will look nice, or at least sort of nice. And see, that almost looks like a rock already. That's pretty cool. Don't worry about these glitchy looking polygons. I can just hit them with smooth. Shift and any brush runs the smooth brush operation. So if you wanted to change the strength of smooth, you go up to smooth brush, and we're going to turn it down so that when I'm using any other brush, I can hold shift. And if you watch this brush area here, if I hold shift and I start using it, I guess it doesn't show. Anyway, it does use the smooth brush. But you can see it's much much gentler now with the edges. It's not as dramatic. It's because I changed the settings inside of this particular brush here, and it uses the smooth brush. So if I was to like clay strips like this, and I wanted to add something, you know, and then if I didn't like that or I wanted it to be smoothed out, just hold shift. Very simple. So I mean, you know, it looks pretty neat. It's almost got like that bulky looking aspect to it that some rocks have. There's ways you could flatten's different than scrape. Flatten will actually flatten to a plane. So it raises and lowers to try to flatten out an area. I don't use it as often as I use scrape. So now that we're at this stage, you'll notice it is very basic. Like the planes are defined, but if we look at our references, there's like the main planes, and then there's like these little planes inside. And getting those, you could do it manually. It would take a lot of time. You'd sort of want it to be like almost a pseudo, random effect, but like with a really controlled ability. You don't want it to look too intentional, I suppose. So we're going to save this for now. I saved it in Rock Sculpt, whatever, it's fine. And we're going to open GIMP. And now we're going to make a file, new, and we're going to make it 2K should be fine. You can make it smaller. This is a neat function in GIMP and in Blender actually. So if you want to know what 2K is, I know 1K is 1024, right? Some people have memorized everything, of course, but you just type multiplied by 2, and then you get 2K, 2048. So it needs to be square. Under Advanced, you want to make sure the 16-bit floating point is selected. And everything else is fine. That's a terrible color. That should be white. Flood fill that. So now we're going to use the brush, this thing up here, paintbrush. We're just going to select, should it be the hard edge one? I think it's this one. Yeah. Okay, so I've also selected dynamics down here, and I went over here to the dynamics random copy. I went to the paint dynamics editor. So you get there. I can't remember exactly how I got that. Dockable dialogues and then paint dynamics. And that'll open up paint dynamics on the side here for you. It's already open though. Okay, well, whatever. So I click on paint dynamics copy. No, I click on here. And then I go down here and duplicate this dynamics, because you can't actually edit the dynamics of the inbuilt ones as far as I know, at least not through the program. You might be able to do it from the back end, but that's fine. So I copy dynamic random, I make it my own, and then I go in here and I'm going to edit the properties. Now this will let you change angle, size, and opacity. It changes everything actually, spacing, rate, flow. So it's very useful for, but see what I've done now, I've selected random size. Now the brush is changing sizes, which is quite cool. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer just for the sake of it. Come on, open up. Pen's having trouble. Transparency, okay. Now I'm just going to see what it looks like if I paint. Okay, that's a little too soft. Hardness, I'm going to change that a little bit. That's better. Okay. Hard. It has to be pretty hard, but I don't want it to be too hard. So the reason I did that is so I have a white and a black, so I can just go on, right-click, edit, clear. It makes it easier. So I'm going to sort of scrub around the edge like this. You want nice big chunkies, like those pointies. It almost looks a little bit like rock, actually. Now you can play around as much as you like with what it should look like, but anyway, this will be fine. This will actually do quite well. You don't want it too regular, so I'm going to change this up a little bit and just take a few chunks out of it like that. Sort of make it look like a rock, to be honest. Rocks and rocks. It's rockception. Okay. Now that this is done, or whatever that is, this is going to be our first brush for sculpting in Blender. So I'm showing you how to make a very basic brush. I've considered whether or not I should go into any more detail about brushes, because they're really easy to make nice rock textures. If you make a brush, you can just quickly sculpt like a mountainside or something like that with the right brush set. So we're going to save this, save as. Actually, no, what we're going to do is, I don't really want to keep this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export. Export as. Project. I should have done this ahead of time. It's in this one. So I'm going to export it as a PNG. The reason I don't want to use it as a JPEG is because JPEGs generally can't store 16-bit information. 16-bit information is important. You get it. 8-bit information is problematic for creating alpha brushes because you end up with a much more stepped grade. So if you can imagine a gradient, between two spaces, white and black, 16-bit, you won't be able to see the steps as easily as you can in 8-bit. 8-bit would be like a big step, big step, big step. 16-bit is a much higher bit resolution or bit depth, so you have very fine steps that you really can't see. I find 16-bit is enough, and this looks fine. Export it. So now that that's exported, I'm going to go back in my Blender, and I'm going to go to demonstrate this, to make a new brush. See that here? It says display number of users of this data. So for whatever reason, the brushes seem to they share 2 users. I don't know why. 2 individual things are using the data from this brush. So it also says click to make a single user copy. So right now I have a single user copy. For whatever reason, it still displays 2 for my second copy. And if you look under brush, there's 2 of them now instead of 1. So I'm going to rename it. Going to rename it rock draw. Yeah, draw. Okay, that did nothing. It's the same thing as it was before, except now I have two different. I have my original and I have my rock brush. So if you mess up somewhere, you can reset it, or reset brush, and you can change the types down here that the brush that you're selecting will mimic. So I suppose you could have all of your brushes under just one. Like, I haven't played around with that yet. So something that's not particularly intuitive with Blender is, let's start here. We say, okay, I want this brush. I want to paint that thing I just made. That I'm going to use that. So if I go down here to texture, so far it's intuitive enough. Click new. Okay, so I'm going to name the texture draw text. And there's nothing there. Okay, so what do you do from here? Well, if you go down here, texture properties, if you click this, you'll be in rock draw text under brush. And you're going to want an image or a movie. Yes. So we're going to open the rock brush. Is that the one I made? Yeah, I think that's the one I made. I made one previously. All right, so now it looks like everything's settled out. The weird thing is, though, is that now I can actually rename this like that. So now I go up to brush. Now I have rock draw text. See, there's the brush. Okay, that's great. That's the texture. I go down to the texture. This is the texture, rock draw text. And under the texture, I have an image, rock draw brush underscore PNG. And then this is the file. So if I was to go out to, actually, you could just display it from sculpting. If I was to go over here, and I guess you can't. Okay. Hold on. I'll just change the layout. It's fine. And I will just change this to texture image editor. So now if I load an image, rock brush 01 underscore PNG. And it did load PNG, just really close. So now it's loading the PNG, but it's loading the like container that has the data source. The file we created is this, and that's how you would set it. Is under here. You would look at rock draw text, and then that's the name of the container, the texture container. This is the image that the texture container is using. And then of course you have your brush settings. I'll just close that. You have your brush settings where you go back up the tool, and that's the texture that you're using. You're using a texture container. So it's not entirely intuitive, but it's not like super horrible either. So anyway, so what does this do? So since it's draw, it does something weird. Oh, wow, that's really awful. Not what I wanted to do at all. Okay. It's tiled. So let's change it to random. Undo that. Random is what you'd think. It's random. It's actually quite neat. So that's not quite what we'd like. I mean, it's not bad. If we select random rotation, it helps a little bit. Still not quite what we're looking for. It's getting there. Something else you can do with a brush is if you hold Control, it'll do the opposite. It digs in instead of adds, or whatever the brush does. So this is adding, and this is digging in. And then Shift is soft, is smooth. So you can see that, you know, if you wanted to, you could play around with this and you could get some interesting, decent results. You know, it's starting to look a little like a rock, but I think we can do better than this. Just undo a few of those. If we go down to sample bias, okay, so the size, the offset, it just offsets this image when you paint. So if I change this to like, you know, a little bit like that, I don't know if you could see it. Yeah, it's painting like offset. The size is important because if I did this, and then I'll just copy that, and you can see it will paint like really, really big. So it's sort of just painting the edges, which is kind of nice, to be honest, because then you can like paint in a bunch of edges, you know, and you get a little bit of layer depth in your rock. You smooth it out a little bit. You know, you could do some interesting things, and it's starting to look pretty good. You know, I add some procedural texture on top of this, and it would look really nice. But there's some other methods that I found that made it look even better in a way, especially to sculpt some more of the larger features instead of just the surface texture for the rock. And for that, well, I'll go over sample bias for one. So sample bias is how it's biasing the neutral point for your image here. So this is just really black and white. So I don't know if I can display it if it's just black and white. So the sample bias will shift that one way or the other. See, it's sort of protruding a little bit there. Let's change the sample bias way down. Yeah, now it's digging in a little bit. So if you have a more, see, this is actually really useful because it's generating some very interesting depth for us. And smooth those out. Another thing you could do is you could literally just sculpt across it like this, just like that. Smooth it out a tiny bit. And then you can go over it with, you can hit it with a scrape. And this will give you a bit more of a, you know, a flatter kind of rocks or, it's, you know, chips are flaking off or something like that. All right, let's go into, so we want to use the scrape brush. And we're going to add another scrape brush. We're going to call it rock scrape. Just rock scrape. Okay, rock scrape and scrape. We want to keep the original scrape because it's useful too. So we're also going to, I don't think you can share textures, doesn't seem like it from here, but you can go down here and actually load rock brush PNG. So it shares it from that end. That's why it can get a little confusing. Okay. So what does that do? Just without changing any details. Well, again, it's tiled. Not going to do anything tiled, is it? Nothing useful. And see, when I scale the brush, you can actually see the image. That's why I made it sort of round, because otherwise it clips off at the edges. That's called fall off. I can change the fall off. But what does this do? Well, it's kind of hard to see it because it's still just scraping it, right? It does give the scrape more texture, which kind of looks nice. You know, I mean, that's nice because you want that kind of like slightly raised texture. So, plane trim, pretty important. We're going to set this to random for now. Plane trim is pretty important. There's area radius. So what this does is it sort of changes the radius away from the operation of the brush that the vertices are affected. If I change it to a lower value, it's sort of like harder. It's kind of hard to describe what's going on here. So the next thing is the orientation. So we're going to look at the fall off is smooth. Fall off can be changed. Smooth is fine, because if we change it from smooth, you end up getting some odd results. Like let's change the consistent or constant. You have kind of ugly results. Like it's between brush strokes, you're seeing like the imprint of the brush doesn't smooth between brush strokes very well. Under stroke, space is the amount of space that the operation will tick for, like the brush tick. So if I change the space lower, it ticks more frequently. It's hard to see in scrape, but that's what it's doing. Dot, there's also anchored. Anchored is interesting because you can literally just drag something and then it'll do it. So if you wanted to perform a scrape operation on just one corner, you could make anchored, you could use it anchored and then 100% strength and then just scrape the corner. That is super cool, you know? But that's not quite what we want to do. You can do this with any of the brushes. We're going to change it back to space. Airbrush, you can hold the brush in a location and it will perform an operation as you're holding it. So that's how that works. And drag dots is like dragging a bunch of, no, it's dragging a dot. Like, so you would drag it there. It's not very useful for scrape, but if you're like placing like bolt heads or something like that, you can just drag it, place it, drag it, place it, drag it, place it. It's quite nice. Line is like a line of the operation. So it's not, could be useful for this operation actually. But for now, since it's what I was practicing with, we're going to use space. And under advanced, that's where it is. I'm going to turn off accumulate. I'm going to use view plane and normal. I'm going to explain what these do because they're kind of important for this. View plane is interesting. Now that's dramatically different, isn't it? It's also extremely strong, the effect. The reason that's different is because I'm using the view plane to dictate the orientation of my plane that I'm scraping at. What normal does is when locked, keep using normal of surface where stroke was initiated. So if I use area plane, and let's say I want to scrape a surface, and I want the surface to be consistent, then as long as I'm holding the brush down, it samples the surface here, it takes the surface normal, and it figures out which plane I want to scrape. But if I leave it constant, it will always scrape in that normal direction. And this is rather nice for getting rock shelves. Like that looks quite nice. That looks almost like you would see part of the, especially that like little shelf area. We're going to look at our pure ref. So here is an example. There's like a little shelf. It breaks off to there. And even inside, there's microscopic shelves, like these little tiny shelves. So what I have found is if I do this, and I look at this, like let's say I want to add a shelf here. I can do that, except I'm going to set it to view plane. Like that. And probably accumulate. I mean, it's a little deep. Try accumulate for now. I can get some really interesting texture going on. It looks pretty bad right now because it's not very soft. And the fall off is set to smooth. And the hardness is set to 0. Anyway, so one thing to note though is that when you do this, you're going to have stretched polys. So that's not good because when you go to smooth it, what happens is those sort of snap together. You don't want that to happen because you like that ridge. So you need to go down to Dino Topo again and detail flood fill. And after that's done, you can see that poly's filled in. So then if you go and smooth it, it's not so bad. Don't quite hit it with a smooth brush yet. Actually, I think we need a little more detail. So what I'm going to do is try to establish some major details first. And then maybe work on some of the smaller ones. I'm going to change that spacing a little higher. So now we just establish some details. Maybe there's some cracks in the rock, you know. Zoom out a little bit, get a bit of a bigger effect going on. Oh, Dino Topo's still on. See, it's trying to recalculate all of the geometry. It's adding geometry, so we're just going to turn that off. There we go. And a way to get a little, like some of the detail to be a little flatter, like let's say you want this, but you don't want heavily ridged. You can use area plane and sort of chew away at it a little bit because it'll sample the area plane. So it keeps it more in line with what you think. And just make like little ridges. That's a nice way of getting some ridge detail. Again, with scrape, if you hold the control key, it'll do the opposite. It'll create ridges. So one thing you can do to make nice little ridges is switch to view plane and then hold down control, sort of angle your view to the plane you're on, and just like sculpt in some ridges. Like let's say this rock had some ridges here. It actually looks more macro rock, like much larger. And then I'm going to put some cracks everywhere, every once in a while. Realistically though, most of this detail won't be visible unless you're going to be rendering a very detailed rock. If you're using this for ArcViz or something else, you're going to be having a very limited detail rock. So it's not going to be as, like a lot of the detail is going to be coming from the texture or from procedural textures. So you're not really going to have the, you're not really going to have all that detail. So it's going to get decimated. Anyway, we're going to sculpt a few things. The rock you saw at the intro, they were mostly sculpted this way. I did make a few brushes to expedite the process. So I will show you a rock brush. This is a way of getting some interesting looking. The reason I preserve the scrape is because a lot of the times you're like, oh, well, it's way too much detail. For rocks, if you just scrape off a little bit of the surface, often you can get to a nice looking rock without losing any of that really interesting detail. One thing I've noticed is that ridges stand out really well when you get the procedural textures on the rock. But I mean, this is sort of like the geologic process, right? The rock is like broken into this ragged, jagged shape, and then it's sort of worn off. And you get this like this worn off shape looking thing. Okay, so I'm going to load one of the brushes that I created. You can purchase brushes as well, and I have purchased a few brushes. They're quite helpful. I'm going to go to Draw. I'm going to make a new brush. Doesn't matter. I don't want that one. New texture. I'm going to open. It's always important to separate the assets that you create from the assets you've downloaded, just for references in the future. So I've made some cracks, and I've made this thing here. It's a process to make these because they're very difficult to make just in Photoshop because of the subtlety in the image. There's a way of making them in Blender which gives you some very nice results, but it's kind of a more complex way. I'll probably eventually have a video on it. So what we need to do now is, I could just use space, and that's not going to do anything. Let's change this to 1. And we're seeing something now. So I'm going to change the bias just to get the rock brush to work. So you can see it makes the surface look like rocks. And this is crazy because you can literally just sculpt flat surfaces, put some detail on them, and then just run a brush over it, and you've almost got a rock. Like, it's kind of wild. So I will put a little bit more here, and then I will change the brush size just for diversity. Change the brush size again. Don't want to crowd the image so it looks like there's too much of one texture. So you want to avoid, human eye can notice certain level of repetitive detail, but you want to try to break it up a little bit to try to fake it, to like confuse the eye and deceive it to thinking it's looking at something that's not intentionally designed. Okay, so it's a rock, it's got some bumps on it. At this point, I'm going to use Dino Topo and just flood it again. And I'm going to switch this for a different texture. I'm going to open crack texture that I made. This is another one I made. So with this one, I don't want it to just paint everywhere. Right? I mean, it's okay, but I don't want it to just paint everywhere. And I'll redo that. So I want to drag, I want to place it. So anchored, not airbrush, anchored. I'm going to change the sample bias to be quite low. I want it to recede or dig in. That's pretty much what I'd like. So I can now change this so I can like add a crack across the front maybe. I'll add maybe another one across the side. Just add them in a few places. I'm going to change the texture back. And you can set up several brushes for this, but I can't bother it at the moment. So I want to make this harder. Was that? Oh, it's not what I wanted. It was space. That's it. Space. The final frontier. Okay, so you can see the hardness. That's yeah. So we're gonna check out fall off. Maybe I can change the fall off to a bit sharper. It's just it's too once you get these brushes tweaked, you can just have like a library of them. You know, that's more evident. That's easier to see. They break up our line there a little bit. And then once we hit it with a little bit of rock, you could even go through again and like carve out some of those areas. Go back to scrape. I won't take too much time here. Set it to not view plane, area plane. Some of these areas don't have enough. Like there's a lot of detail here. There's not a heck of a lot here. It's a different kind of detail. So I want to give it like a sort of a ridged look. Maybe a piece of rock broke off there or something. Break up the edges a bit. That might be too fine. And that's the wrong one. Scrape. Oh, that's very, very scrapey. Got some of these. The plane trim, I'm not sure. I had it set so that it's a little better, I guess. Oh, maybe not. So otherwise you can see like the circle around it. I think if I turn this one down, it'll sample a smaller size. It'll give me a bit more diversity or It's randomizing the, change this to 90. Okay, try a view plane. Some of this requires a little bit of playing around with, but essentially we've already got a rock. You know, I mean, put some lines in it. Then I think I might hit that with a little bit of smooth. The next step, the next video, will be about procedural textures and textures in general, to get your rock looking a little bit, to get your rock looking perfect, basically. It's going to bring it home. So like if you were to render this right now, look a little like a mess, it would look okay. But it does look kind of like a rock. It's not perfect. And let me tell you, those rock brushes, they make a huge difference. So we're going to leave it here for now. We're recording for a while. And we're going to look at what this looks like rendered. Right now it's not going to look like anything, it's going to look like a gray blob, because remember, we need to add a light. You know, it doesn't look too bad. Change the light. Make another light. It is just a gray texture, but it does actually look like a rock. If you look at the shadows, yeah. So we will leave it here, and next time we will texture this beast to really bring it home, make it look really convincing. We're going to need, you might need to go and take photographs of a bunch of different rocks. I'm going to show you how to put together a texture for applying to this thing, and we're going to go through procedural textures to give it some roughness, some visible roughness. So that's all in the next episode. Stay tuned. I'll see you then.